unfortunately, the constitution doesn't last. The political reform that it outlines is a great threat to the partitioning powers, and especially the Russians are very eager to crush it. So they do, and there is this war in 1792, which doesn't end well for Poland. It ends with its second partition, followed by the Kościuszko uprising in 1794, which unfortunately is crushed this Polish-American hero, as he also fought in the American Revolutionary War. He returns to Poland, he fights on, he really becomes a great leader who manages to attract the masses to follow him. A large portion of the peasantry is inspired by his radical ideas about liberty for all classes. But unfortunately, it's not enough. The Russians simply have more soldiers. And the uprising, which is proclaimed in Warsaw, it also ends in Warsaw with the slaughter of Praga, with the Russian troops taking control of this eastern part of Warsaw that is on the eastern bank of the Vistula River. The Russian troops storm it, and they kill around 20,000 people, almost all of them civilians. So it is an event that is remembered for decades and decades in the minds of Warsavians. Later on, during the Warsaw Uprising and the massive massacres during the Second World War against the population of Warsaw, you could still hear some elderly Warsavians lamenting that this is something on par or even worse than what was done to us in 1794. So the memory was long. In general, the 18th century, it was this interesting dynamic of, at the same time, you have Warsaw growing as a city. By the end of it, it crosses 120,000.
And I think in the 18th century, it's probably worth mentioning the impact of the Saxon kings.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And particularly if we look at urban development, the Saxon axis.
Yes.
We mentioned Wilanów earlier, and the Royal Castle and the north-south route.
Yes.
And of course, the Saxon axis goes east-west, which was a deliberate attempt to create something new from the Voller field, which you mentioned earlier, across the river.
Yes.
And some great plans for urban development.
Absolutely.
Which are today, we have the Saxon Gardens, and a couple of the old palaces are more or less left. But of course, the Second World War destroyed much of what had been, unfortunately, planned.
And naturally, the grandest of these buildings was the Saxon Palace.
Well,
naturally named after the Saxon kings. It was rebuilt and it had this great Baroque form, and it was built in 1848. This Saxon Palace was, as you mentioned, blown up by the Germans after the end of the Warsaw Uprising. But finally, I think it was last year, or maybe it was a year earlier than that, but recently a decision was taken that Poland will rebuild the Saxon Palace. It will be one of these grand projects of the last 30 years. A special piece of legislation was initiated by the president, and after receiving parliamentary approval, it was also signed by him, and the state will go in and dedicate a large chunk of money for the reconstruction of it. And now they are excavating the foundations again at what is Piłsudski Square, right in front of the tomb of the unknown soldier. So this will be a process that will last a good 7, 8, maybe even 10 years. But hopefully in the future, when tourists come, they will be able to see this grand palace being rebuilt just as it was in the mid-19th century.
I think it's fair to point out that, as was the way with 18th century monarchs, of course, even at the time, Augustus the second ran out of money when he was planning this, so not all the buildings were built.
Yes, and this is unfortunately a recurring theme in Warsaw. A major plan is introduced, it starts, and then due to various reasons it ends. So one was by Augustus, Another one was by the mayor, Stefan Starzyński, who was given power over Warsaw in 1934. And he came in and he had this dream. There is this quote of him saying that I had a dream, and that was for Warsaw to be grand. So he also started many projects. Some of them were completed, but for example, the Warsaw metro system that was very far gone in the planning stage, and was more or less most of those projects were scheduled to be completed by the mid-1940s. But naturally, with the outbreak of the Second World War, all of that came to nothing.
Adam, as usual, the clock has defeated. I'm just going to have to ask you to pause there, but we will pick it up next time. There we are. I've interrupted Adam almost in mid-sentence, but we will pick up the story next time on Poland Daily History, so please join us then. In the meantime, thank you for watching.